like it, then there it is. Okay, so let me know what you think. So today's case was recommended to me by one of you guys. Thank you so much. This case literally knocked my socks right off my feet while I was standing and wearing them. Not even kidding. This is a case that took place way back in 1954 in a town called Christchurch, New Zealand. Christchurch is one word, Christchurch. But this case, even though it happened all the way back then, it has a lot of present day ramifications. Maybe that's the right word, I don't know, but it carries on into the future, let's just say. So, let me not drag the intro any longer. This is the case of two very close best friends named Juliet Hume and Pauline Parker. And once again, it's another case where the people will change their names later in the story, which just makes it that much harder for me to keep everyone's name straight, but I hope I can do it. So let's start with Juliet. She was born in 1938 in London. She had two parents and had a younger brother. Her father was a brilliant and well-known physicist. He eventually would go on to be involved in the creation of the H-bomb. And her mother was said to be an aristocrat. Now, when Juliet was only 2, it was said that she was, quote, bomb shocked by the Blitz. That refers to the bombing of London by Germany back in like 1940 or 41. And when they said she was bomb shocked, that's the same thing that they then referred to as shell shocked, and that we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. So basically, she was 2 years old, she witnessed this or heard it, and it, scared her out of her wits and led to lasting consequences. Now, not only did she have that to deal with, but she was a physically sickly child. She had bouts of pneumonia, bronchitis, and even tuberculosis. Now, England or London has very harsh winters, so her parents would often send her off to live with a friend, like a family friend, in a warmer country such as South Africa. was a very sickly child. She had had osteomyelitis at 5 years old, which is the swelling of the bones. I believe it was in her ankle. Often caused by an infection. She had spent a lot of time in the hospital and had had multiple operations. She experienced a lot of pain. And she walked with a limp. So, now let me just tell you a little bit more about her. She was also born in 1938. She was born in New Zealand. She had a mother and a father. Now, her parents, as it turned out, had never been married, but people didn't really realize it at the time. You see, her father was a little bit older than the mother, and he had been married already and had had multiple children, but he had never officially divorced. And when he met Pauline's mother, and he broke up with his first wife and moved on to live with Pauline's mother, whose name was Honora. When he moved in with her, they obviously never could get married because he already was married, but he had no further contact really with his previous family. But meanwhile, with him and his new wife, they had a total of 4 children. One was a couple years older than Pauline, a girl, and she was average child, no major issues. Then there was Pauline, who had these medical problems. They had a child, which sounds like the child had Down syndrome from the way they described it, and had to be institutionalized shortly after birth. And the 4th child died at birth due to a heart defect, so they had had a very rough time of it. The parents, very rough, like seriously. And the father, his name was Herbert. He worked as a fishmonger, and they also took in boarders to make extra money, so I believe that the mother, Honora, took care of that aspect, keeping up the house and all for the boarders. So, when Pauline met her new friend, Juliet, they became like this, okay? Super, super tight. In an obsessive way, like over the top. And one thing was that Juliet had a pony, and she used to ride it over to visit Pauline. And Pauline loved the pony because she realized that on a pony, her disability didn't matter. Whatever it was that was wrong with her leg, it didn't matter when she was on the pony. So she asked her parents for a pony. And of course, they said no. But somehow, she got the money in some sneaky way, it was said. And she bought a pony. I have no idea what a pony cost back then in New Zealand, but I understand that it is very, very specifically the parents, and Pauline's parents brought her to a psychiatrist and said, please talk to our daughter and find out what is the deal. They wanted to know if she was involved in homosexual activity. And after the doctor spoke to her, he said he believes that she is involved in homosexual activity. Now, at that time, in the 50s, homosexuality was a mental illness. Okay? So it was a lot more taboo back then than it is now. And it was treated in a very different way. So the doctor had suggested you really need to separate these girls. Like, this is not good. This is not okay. This is mentally ill. Now, we do not know if that is accurate. We don't know. Okay? That is just what they were all thinking at the time. There's no proof either way. Anyway, now Juliet wound up becoming sick again with tuberculosis and going back into the hospital for a few more months, during which time Pauline wrote to her almost daily, and her parents were pretty pleased that, they got some time apart, but they didn't really, because mentally they were still together, writing letters, telling each other stories in the letters, that sort of thing. And as soon as she got out of the hospital, they were right back to where they started. Now, a man from England, his name was Walter Perry. He was an engineer. He came to New Zealand for an extended business trip, and Juliet's parents invited him to stay with them because they had a 16-room mansion. Now, one day, Juliet came home to find her mother in bed with this man, and she was horrified. But her mother told her, here's the thing, your father and I are splitting up. He knows about this affair. So, on the day of June 22nd, 1954, Juliet found a brick, I guess near her home. She brought it with her. And Pauline, she had a stocking, like pantyhose, but it's just one stocking. And they went together with Pauline's mother, Honora, to Victoria Park. And they had a kiosk there where they sat and had tea and snacks at first. And Juliet gave the brick to Pauline. Pauline put the brick in the stocking, tied it up. Now, Juliet had been collecting some pretty little colored stones or pebbles from a few days back. And what she did was, when the three of them left the kiosk and they started to take a walk through the park, she began scattering these colorful pebbles. And she walked ahead. Juliet walked in front, and the mother and daughter walked a little bit behind. So, after they had walked a little ways out into the park, Pauline said to her mother, "Oh, look at that pretty pink stone." Her mother bent down to look at it, and Pauline took out the brick in the stocking and flung it at her mother's head as hard as she could. And she thought that that would be enough. Both girls thought she could hit her one time in the head and she would be dead, but it never works like that. So she had to hit her over and over and over. And then Juliet came and she took the brick and she started hitting Honora over and over till they had hit her something like 45 times, and sadly, she died. They were covered with blood, as you can imagine. And they took off running. Well, first they tossed the brick into the woods there. They ran back to the kiosk, screaming that the mother had fallen and hit her head. She had hit her head many times. Not just once, but she fell. And then she kind of just banged her head a bunch of times. So the people at the kiosk called the police, and they let the girls wash up, because they were, like I said, covered with blood. The police came and they looked at Honora and said, "This is not from falling." Like, they were no fools, okay? They could tell when someone's been hit in the head. Plus, they did find the brick in the stocking, and it was covered with blood. So, ultimately, not immediately, but ultimately, the two girls were arrested. And at first, they did say that she fell. And they're like, okay, come on. No, she didn't. So they did both confess to the crime. Now, mind you, the father at this point, Juliet's father, took off. He took his son and they went to England, leaving behind the mother, Hilda, to deal with this mess. And over on the other side, you have Pauline. Well, her mother is not there to help her because she was murdered. And the father, Herbert, well, he was actually, as you can imagine, pretty heartbroken, upset, angry, all those things. He doesn't seem like he was one of those men that we often hear about in these true crime cases who says, "You know what, I forgive you. I know you killed my wife and your mother, but I forgive you." No, he didn't seem that type. He was since they were, well, at the time, Juliet was 15 and Pauline had turned 16. They were tried as minors, and they were tried for murder. The case was basically to decide if they were sane or not, because they had already confessed to having done it. Now, if it was said that they were lesbians, that would already be a certain level of insanity for that day and age. So the prosecution really tried to veer away from that concept. In fact, they had a statement from the father, Herbert, saying that Pauline had been involved with boys, that she liked boys, try to show that she wasn't a lesbian. He also explained that on the day of the murder, the girls, he saw both the girls and they were both in normal spirits, normal moods, nothing off about them, laughing, talking like a regular day, so he didn't see any insanity that day. The prosecutor showed that the motive was simply to get Honora out of the way so they could move together to South Africa. So it's as simple as that. That was the motive for murder. Now I want to read to you their confessions, because it's pretty interesting. So, the confession of Pauline Parker. She said, I quote, "I killed my mother. Had made up my mind to do it some days before. I don't know how many times I hit her. A great many, I imagine." That's her confession. Juliet said, quote, "I gave the brick to Pauline. I know it was put in the stocking. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen when we went to Victoria Park. I thought we might have been able to frighten Mrs. Reaper / Parker with the brick, and she would have given her consent for me and Pauline to stay together. I saw Pauline hit her mother with the brick in the stocking. I took it and hit her too. After the first blow was struck, I knew it would be necessary for us to kill her. I was terrified, hysterical." So, do those confessions sound sane or insane? Okay, so the girls were asked if they understood the penalty for killing someone. You know, to try to get to see, did they understand? Are they old enough to understand what's happening here? Are they responsible? So, when they were asked, Juliet drew a finger across her throat like this, so that's the penalty for murdering someone, which it was at the time, if you were an adult, okay? And Pauline looked at her from under the brim of her hat and smiled, so that was the response from both of them. Now, some other interesting things that you need to hear. Pauline kept a diary, like so many killers do. So the verdict was guilty, and they got 5 years each because they were children, and they had to serve their time in 2 separate prisons. And they were to never be in contact with each other ever again. That was part of the sentencing. So they did their time, and they got out in 5 years. Now, Juliet, she moved to England. She changed her name to Anne Perry. I believe that name, Perry, she took from her mother's. You remember the boyfriend, whatever you want to call him, the engineer from England who stayed with them. His last name was Perry. The mother may have probably married him, remarried. So anyway, Anne Perry became her new name. She worked several different jobs, one of which was a stewardess. She moved to America, to California, and she became a Mormon. She was very involved with that. And in 1979, she published her first book under the name Anne Perry. Now, nobody knew about this, okay? No one knew her true identity. And she became a huge bestseller. And at this time, current time, she's written over 100 books. She's won many awards. I believe she writes historical fiction, mystery type novels. A lot of them are a series of books. But in 1994, a movie was made called Heavenly Creatures, all about this crime. And then, same year, a book was written called The Search for Anne Perry, The Hidden Life of a Best-Selling Crime Writer. Okay, so that book outed her. So that's when people found out who she actually was, and at the time, I guess it was pretty shocking. I never heard of it, and probably most of you never heard of it. I think if you lived in New Zealand in 1954, you heard of it. But anyway, now, funny thing is that my mother-in-law is a big reader. So I asked her, have you ever heard of Anne Perry? She was like, of course. I said, did you know she was a murderer? And her mouth fell open. She's like, what? Who did she murder? Anyway, so the secret was well guarded until 1994, but once it was out, she was willing to speak to reporters about it, and she denied ever being homosexual. That became like a huge piece of the story for some reason. Like, people were obsessed with that aspect, and I believe that in the movie they made it like a thing. I didn't watch the movie, but if you have, let me know. So she said we were not lesbians, and she said she was a virgin until she was 20. That's what she said. Okay. And now the other woman, Pauline, she changed her name to Hillary Nathan. She is now 84, by the way. And Anne Perry is 83. I believe she's living in Hollywood right now. I think at some point she moved to Scotland, and then I think to Hollywood. So back and forth a bit. So now, Hillary, after she got out of prison, it took her supposedly about 5 years to come to terms, 5 more years, to come to terms with what had happened. relationships. She became a devout Roman Catholic. She didn't watch any TV. She didn't listen to any radio. She wouldn't give any interviews. But her sister explained this much about her. And the two women have not been in contact since the crime, from what we know. And that is the case. So what do you think? Well, I'll tell you a little bit of what I think. I am wondering, as we talk about a lot, and people have differing opinions about if people can be rehabilitated or if people can change. So is it possible to kill someone in cold blood, premeditated, just killing somebody for some minor reason, like in this case, and to walk away from it with so little remorse as they did, but then to go on and live lives that have no crime in them, to become very remorseful, and to be successful and give something good to society? Like, is that possible? Did that happen here? I mean, in the case of Pauline, she seems to have moved on to live a very depressed kind of life. But it does sound like she became a completely different person. The guilt from having murdered her mother took any chance of happiness away from her. You know what I'm saying? And we don't usually hear about that. And both of these women became very religious, which I believe has something to do with guilt for what they did. So is this a scenario where they changed after having committed the crime? So was the 5 years in prison a proper amount of time? I mean, aside from talking about that, of course I could say what they did was horrible, absolutely evil. I mean, nothing up to that point was horrible, evil, nothing. It was just, they were two girls. They apparently were overly obsessed. The relationship was not healthy.